So I'm Margery Kraus. I'm the founder and executive chairman of APCO Worldwide. And I'm here today to tell you a little bit about maybe past, present, and future, and to understand more about the journey that I've taken to get this company going and established. And I guess I should start with the beginning of this story, which is my childhood. I'm the first generation in my family to live in the United States. My parents were both born in Poland. My father came here as an infant and was practically murdered at the border because my grandparents snuck out of Poland and he was 1 year old and he started to cry. And I think my grandfather was worried about the noise, but my grandmother prevailed and my father lived on. And then my mother was born in Poland, as I said, in Warsaw, but she was raised in Cuba because as her father tried to make his way to the United States and then send for his family, which at that point was my mother and her younger brother. She later was there. There were two more siblings involved. But they got as far as Cuba. And so my grandfather settled in Havana and sent for his young family, and they were raised in Cuba. And my mother lived in Cuba. It was really her native country. She lived there from the time she was like 3 or 4 until she got married. So, so I've had the good fortune of being raised in kind of a multicultural environment, which I think kind of made me a lot more empathetic to the diversity that I've experienced over time, being in more than 30 countries in the world with my company. So that my grandparents settled in a town that was a mining town of 3,000 people in New Jersey, and my grandfather was the peddler, the baker. My grandparents were both bakers. And my grandfather was very entrepreneurial, and within a short time, he had the biggest bakery in the county. And we grew up in the beginning of our life. Our apartment was above the bakery with all those wonderful smells. And I can remember running down and putting the jelly in the jelly donuts and overstuffing them, much to my grandfather's chagrin. But that was where life started. And I think it's important to know kind of how your roots affect you. So, growing up in this town, which is where I lived until I went off to college, was the kind of town where everybody knew each other and was, for better or for worse. And my father did not want to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. And after World War II, when my father came back, he started what was a war surplus store and eventually became a department store in this small town, the only department store. And so from the time we were all could look over the counter, we worked. The store was open 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And it was a family business, and we all participated. And even my mother, who worked there quite a lot, I never thought of her as a working mother because that's just what we did. And she would leave to go home and help us with homework and make dinner and do all those things. But one of the things it taught us also was not only the importance of hard work, but the importance of really building relationships with customers. I only learned later in life that my father did a lot of things on a handshake. I would run into people. My father lived with me the last 3 years of his life. He died at 93. And people would come up to me and say, if it wasn't for your dad, I wouldn't have gotten married. I couldn't have gotten married. And I said, how's that? And they said, well, I didn't have any money and I wanted to buy an engagement ring, and your father gave it to me on a handshake. And I paid what I could when I could. And it was very much that kind of thing because there were no credit cards at the time. And credit was something that you extended out of your own goodwill more than anything else. But, my dad was a very generous guy and very well liked in this town. And And it's something, those relationships were something that just stuck with me, that I understood what the power of relationships do. And I think I've carried that my whole life, but also into the work and how I've thought about work. So, small towns breed certain kinds of values. And I married somebody from Brooklyn, New York. So I was able to observe the difference and kind of how you grow up and how it influences you. But anyway, so for my small town, it also was an interesting place because my school was K through 12 in one building, not one room, but one building. So I was with the same friends from kindergarten through the time I left town. And it was, I still see these people. We still have reunions, and we're still the same old people we were. And a lot of those people are still in the town. And even though I've gone on to do other things, it's very refreshing to go home and kind of be liked for who you are, or valued for who you are. And my sleepover buddies and all of that, we spend some time reminiscing. And I've been lucky that because of things like Facebook, they've also been the first people to comment when something nice happens to me. So I feel very blessed by that. So I think that probably gives you a sense of my background. I stayed in this town. I told you it was K through 12 in one building. Junior high was the basement. The elementary school was the first floor, and the high school was the top floor. So by the time I was in high school, I felt like I had taken almost all the courses that I could take, and I was feeling a little bit encumbered. And then something terrible happened, which led me to leave high school early, and I'll tell you about that. The town was Franklin, New Jersey, in Sussex County, which is the northwest corner of the state. And it's, when people think of New Jersey, they don't think about this part of the state, but it's quite beautiful and very rural. And it hasn't changed all that much in the years since I've left. But I told you something horrible happened to me, and it influenced the rest of my life. But my mother was one of 4 children, and when we were all growing up, my grandmother was still in Cuba and came a little bit later. But her youngest child, who was closer in age to me than my mother, was my Uncle Sam. And Sammy came to live with us, and he was like even though I had a brother 2 years older, Sam was 7 years older, and he was kind of my hero in life. And we were very close to him. And when he was 21 and I was 14, he got cancer. And at that point in our history, there were no MRIs. There were no, we've come so far. I'm sure he would still be alive today. But so he developed cancer. At first, he had a limp, and they thought it was a basketball injury. He was a senior at NYU, and he it didn't go away, and so they operated, and they found that he had cancer in his spine, and he had probably less than 6 months to live. And when your hero dies and you're 14 and it's in front of your eyes, it has a profound impact. So I sat with him until he died. I mean, pretty much. And it was a gift of time, but I decided right then and there that if I died when I was 21, that I was going to make the most of the years that I had. And I think something that's always driven me in the back of my head is to know that life is short, and that you have to take advantage of opportunities when they come, and they're not always at convenient times. And so that was my first lesson, my first big lesson, and the first big loss I experienced in my early years, and one that had a profound impact on me. I still think about him, and I think he would be very proud right now. But it's, I wished he could have known my kids, and he died before I met my husband. So I feel like, that was a whole different part of our life. I think the other thing that happened is that when I was there, I got to know one of the doctors who was taking care of him was on rotation from Austria. He was a neurologist, and he was going to move to the United States. And he convinced my parents somehow that I should go spend a summer in Europe and be an au pair to his 3 girls. And so they thought I was so devastated, probably good idea. So a year later, I packed up in the summer and I went off to Europe by myself. And I traveled to Austria through Europe, stopping along the way and traveling back by myself, coming the other way. And so you can imagine all the experiences I had. And so when I came back to the US and went back to my high school, which at this point seemed very small in my life, I decided that I would, not to waste a moment with Uncle Sam ringing in my brain, I went to college and never graduated high school. So I went to college after my junior year of high school. I guess I convinced enough people that I was mature enough and that I had the background to go, but I never got a high school diploma and went off to college I had just turned 17. So that also kind of changed my life too, because it made everything go a lot faster. But that's kind of how I went. And it was quite funny because I didn't get my high school diploma until after I had my master's degree. And then I got it in a most charming way, because one of the things I did early in my career was I helped start a program for high school students. I was involved in civic education. My field was government. And at that time, if you were a woman, your aspiration was to teach or be a nurse. So I went to teach 12th grade government, which I did for a very short time because I took it and created something else with it. But in any event, that's this was a program for high school students to, what I helped create was a program for high school students called the Close-Up Foundation, which has brought 1 million students to Washington to find their voice, to have firsthand view of Washington. And so it was using Washington as a classroom, and that's kind of how I used my degree. But one of the things I was able to do is get my high school invited from Franklin. So it was a big deal for these students, and it was they were very grateful. So in return, they got me the last high school diploma from the school, because the school then got regionalized. So I have my high school diploma from when a year ahead of my daughter, who was a junior in high school at the time, who was furious that I didn't wait another year and get it together. But we didn't, and that's my proudest degree, actually, having gotten my master's after. So that's the first part of my life, the first part of my story. My first few years of marriage, probably, I'm sure people want to give me an insanity check after this. We did start out in a very traditional way, and that lasted about 6 months. So we started out, maybe it was a little more than that. And then we had our first child I guess it was about 18 months later. And I hadn't really thought about working. So I started when my child was an infant, going to grad school, and just to keep my mind active. And then something weird happened. I heard about this organization starting that was bringing young people to Washington to learn about government and politics. And it was exactly something that I wanted to do. And it was a short-term thing. So I went and applied for the job, and they couldn't pay me. So I said that that I would I would agree that if it were success, they would pay me, and if it wasn't, that they wouldn't. And then I was there 14 years, and they did pay me. But anyway, I ended up working, going to night school, and being a young mother all at the same time. And that really taught me a lot about multitasking, about empathy, about anything else. But the other thing I learned is that, these were choices that I made, and that my husband, and initially reluctantly went along with this. I don't think he knew what he got into. But that I learned, that I wouldn't complain, that this taking that much on me was my choice, and that I would just do it. And it was interesting because it was all, the late 60s, early 70s, when life was changing for women anyway. And I was really in an interesting situation, because I was neither part of the generation that said women shouldn't work, they should be professionals, or women should stay at home. I was an anomaly and didn't fit in either place, but I didn't have too much time to think about it either. So I just did every day what I had to do. I'd get up, I'd go to work, I'd, take care of my child, make sure that she was okay. And then later my second child, which I had shortly thereafter, and finished graduate school, and did what I needed to do. And my husband, initially, I think, was overwhelmed by all of this, but I think we've always said that, good relationships are more important than good jobs. And eventually I said, if you don't want me to do it, tell me. And we had a discussion, and we've been a team doing this ever since. And I could not have done this without the support at home, because there were so many times over the years that he ended up driving the carpool, or and he's a lawyer. It's not like he didn't have his own career, but he had a more certain job, in the sense of, not, it was more routine, and he could count on being home at a certain time, and that suited him fine. And he developed a very special relationship with the kids, because we shared a lot of the parenting, which was very unusual at that time.
How much did the women's liberation movement at that time, Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, all those people, affect you?
Well, I think it made me, I think the movement at that time maybe made me think about things. I was, as I said, I was kind of sandwiched between the two camps. I always believed that you should have choice, that I didn't think that women who wanted to stay home and raise their kids, I thought that was a fine choice and profession. And I realized, knowing myself, that if I had done that with all the kind of energy I had, and that I probably would have crushed my kids. But so, I took a different path, but it's not a better path or a worse path. It was just a path. But I also felt that the strident nature of people who are on the other side, I never felt it was all or nothing. I always felt there was this middle ground. And I felt that I enjoyed my kids, and I felt I really would have missed out on something had I not done that. It was never easy, because while the people I work with, a lot of them had more free time and more time to put into things, and more time to themselves, I gave that up, but by free will, because every minute I had was consumed with other responsibilities. And it wasn't easy. But I think that, I can't say that I didn't enjoy every minute of it. And, I'm sure I know there were days I wanted to pull my hair out, but, my kids became a very important part of my support system. And what I learned is that, you can't have it all the time, but that this whole idea of work-life balance doesn't exist. But work-life integration does. And from the very beginning, I tried to find ways to weave work into what my kids either learned or were doing, because I felt it was important for them to understand that I wasn't going to work to escape them, that I was going to do something with purpose, and that would help make our lives better, but also that I cared about, and that I cared about them too. But I think probably the most important lesson from that was to always be present, and not, you can have work-life integration, but you should remember when you're at work and when you're doing other things, and not bring one into the other in terms of where your head is. No matter what kind of day it was, when I walked in that door at home, I made it a point to make sure that I wasn't bringing all my trials and tribulations home. And I've tried to, with one time exception in my life, I think I've done a pretty good job of doing that.
You said,
When I started to work full time after my stint teaching, I helped create a foundation called the Close Up Foundation, which is now in its 50th year, shockingly. And I'm still on the board, shockingly. Um, and it is a program that gave high school students firsthand view of how Washington works. And so, if you want me to wait a minute, this is the joys of working remotely, that you share space with your spouse, and he has the phone and I have the internet, so he still does things the old-fashioned way. Okay, so the Close Up Foundation, which was started, as I said, 50 years ago, was a program to bring high school students to Washington, and they came for a week, and they had firsthand views of, how Congress worked, and how the executive branch worked. They had about a semester's worth of classroom experience, but the classroom was Washington. And I put the program together. I created the first curriculum. I got the speakers to come, and there are some very funny stories, but through this, through my own wits, I mean, I was only 23 years old at the time. So, I'd get Supreme Court justices to speak by calling the court after 5 o'clock, and they answered their own phone. And, I just got to know a lot of people. I was a 23-year-old from a town of 3,000 people in New Jersey. I mean, I certainly wasn't a big name in Washington. And so just by, wits, we put together a great program, and it was an extraordinary experience for these students. It still is. And one of the things that happened was in 1978, I became friends with the person who ultimately started C-SPAN, the cable satellite public affairs network, which broadcasts the Congress. And so I had this idea that we could take Close Up remotely to schools across the country by using this technology. In today's language, this would be like a webinar. It wouldn't be thought of as anything very special. But in 1978, the idea of firsthand interaction with Washington when you're sitting in a classroom in Indiana was a big deal. So I made a deal with C-SPAN, with Brian Lamb, that we helped him get his first mobile unit because he was in a closet in Arlington. And in return, we were able to use some of the downtime on the satellite, and we did public affairs programming to high school students. And we had the students who were in Washington as part of a workshop. And then for some time, we had call-ins. And then eventually, we even had, when Reagan was president, we did 6 programs just with the president. So it was quite something. And at that time, Arnold and Porter was the counsel to a lot of the cities that were building their cable franchises. And through through close up and something I did at that time, they became aware of what we were doing and they were very interested. And so that led to me getting to know these partners at Arnold and Porter who really did project development, and practicing law was a small part of what they did. They had these big creative ideas, and so it was fascinating. And one of the things they wanted to do was to put together a business plan to do this for more cable uh, organizations, which I put together. But then Close Up decided not to go ahead. And Close Up, I thought this would be a kind of a way to fund Close Up, anyway. To make a long story short, when it didn't happen, Arnold and Porter, these partners wanted to set up a consulting affiliate because a lot of the projects they did required talented non-legal professionals. This had nothing to do with PR per se. It was more project development, but they wanted me to come put this together. And it was kind of funny because I was just me, and I even had somebody say to me, no offense, but why you? But they saw something, I guess, that other people maybe didn't see. And so I said that I would do it after a lot of going back and forth, leaving something I really love doing. But then seeing this as an opportunity to see if what I'd learned in the not-for-profit world was actually transferable and whether these skills were transferable. So I decided to do it. And I had a staff of a couple hundred people that I left. I mean, it had been Close Up had become very successful. And I left to start something where it was just me. And when I got there, I realized that there was no real business plan for this or client base. So, you know, have to be started from scratch. So I took what I thought I knew how to do and what the opportunity was, and that was the birth of APCO. And so it didn't start as a communications firm. It started more as a place you went where you couldn't figure out where you had to go because it was a combination of things. It's like you have a problem, you have an opportunity, we'll figure it out. And that's how it started. And that is a big influence on the culture of the firm even today, because that's why we're not traditional, because it was always a matter of, complex problems or opportunities that they were not identifiable as a PR problem or even a government relations problem or something else. It was, how do you bring these tactical resources together to create an opportunity or solve a problem? And so we became known as kind of an interesting place with creative ideas that didn't really neatly fit in a bucket. And so to me, problem solving and connecting dots were things I loved to do, and I had a passion for it. And so I just saw this as an extension of doing that. I didn't really think about where it would take me or how big it was, or I just wanted to be, to be successful in taking on interesting things and then solving those issues and opportunities. And that's really what I did. And that's how APCO started. So it wasn't a matter even of understanding how does an agency work. I knew nothing about any of that. It was just step by step, helping clients, being successful, spreading the word. Then we'd have 2, then we'd have 4, then we'd have, it just grew that way. And eventually, and we weren't that big. I mean, eventually about 20 people. I realized that there were just too many limitations to doing this inside another institution, inside a law firm, because there also wasn't unanimity on why there should be an APCO in a law firm, whether it was to service existing clients or whether it was to make money. And those two things sometimes collided. And I just felt we would never reach our full potential if we were bound by someone else's rules. And so in I guess, 1991. I started in 1984. And in 1991, after achieving about $3 million in revenue, hard fought revenue, and having a staff of about 20 people, I convinced the law firm that they should spin us off. And because they had been very generous to me and they had taken a chance, I felt like I needed to find somebody to buy out their shares because it wouldn't have been fair otherwise. And so Gray Global Group, Gray Advertising, and Ed Meyer, who was the CEO at the time, really was interested. And he eventually he wanted to hire me, and he thought the work would come. And I said I wouldn't do that unless they paid Arnold and Porter, because I just didn't think it was right. And that's what happened. And so they bought Arnold and Porter shares of APCO, and I kept my shares, and we were off to the races. But it also kept a very high standard, because if we could satisfy lawyers in the law firm who were really brilliant, then we felt pretty good about our substantive ability to work on other things. Having spun off, and even before we spun off, we'd have these projects, and we would be doing all the strategy, all the development, the messaging, and then somebody would hire a PR firm for $1 gazillion more than we were getting paid to implement something that was our idea and that we had developed. And I thought, this is really dumb. That isn't, we already did maybe the rocket science part of it. So how hard can this be? I mean, you learn it's harder than you think, but that was really what started it. And then as we were part of Gray, it became more obvious that we needed to reposition what we did. And we took our public affairs heritage, which was deep issue knowledge and ability to work at the corporate level. And we had a whole campaign one year called The Art of Communication. And our brochure were all famous works of art, but what do I want to call it? Made into various issues. It was a clever takeoff anyway. So we started to show up on RFPs and things that we would never have had before. Plus, when we were with the law firm, there was no way we could have marketed ourselves that way. We were in Washington. Our second office in 1988, while we were still with the law firm, was Moscow. Which, yes, it usually has that kind of reaction. Moscow, that was before the curtain came down. And yes, it was. And it was very, in hindsight, maybe a lot stranger than people think. But the fact was that Arnold and Porter, I was very close to the partners in the joint venture practice, and they had been hired by the Gorbachev government to rewrite the joint venture laws of Russia. And so people kept coming and saying, can you help us enter the market? And I figured that, this was that if this were Japan or this were Europe, there are people with a lot more experience than we have that would be ahead of us in line. But being that this was so unusual and there was interest in that market, and everything was opening up. I mean, it's hard to think of it in today's terms because it was very different. And it was almost like a ray of sunshine was entering a dark room. That sunshine has been blocked off now, but for a long time, there was a generation of people who really saw the opportunity on the ground there. They became the oligarchs of the time, but so we were there before. And as these very smart Russians and ambitious Russians started to develop these enterprises, they needed to navigate the West. And we became a trusted partner as they were building brands like UCOS that became very well known in the West. It was the fourth largest oil company until it got taken away by the current regime. But so some of the people who were these early oligarchs, relied on us to help teach them the ways of the West, to help them make relationships in the US and Europe. And it was a really interesting period of time. And these relationships go on till today. I mean, um, because if they were selling computers, or they were cab drivers, or they were theater, they were not billionaires. So, we knew them before. So our second office was Moscow, and that's something that carried over until, as we left Arnold and Porter. And then as we settled into Gray, and it was obvious that one of our strengths, there were two things that drove the business. One was being very integrated in our service. So this idea of communications and public affairs meshing. So the way I saw it is we, in order to deal with a lot of these regulations, or to deal with having people see things your way, you have to condition the environment around it. And that's about stakeholder engagement. And we were talking about this stuff, 30 years ago. I mean, now it's common to hear people talk this way, but we were different. We were out there ahead of time. And when so in 1995, when we opened in Brussels and London from scratch, all these offices were pretty much from scratch and without a headhunter, by going in the market and just learning the market and learning who was good and who. I would ask, who would just die to have working on your business? And you'd find these incredible people. And then I just had to convince them that this crazy lady from the US actually had an idea that maybe is different. And I was lucky that I had some very good people who were 20 years my junior decide to come on board with me. And they're still, many of them still there today, or they've recently retired. But so there was a spirit about this, and there was an adventure about it. And it was really built from scratch. There were no acquisitions. And the reason for that was, I like to think, oh, that was really smart, but it was really hard to do this all from scratch, to go in markets you didn't know, and set up a company, and then have it actually work and be profitable. And because we never had financial backing, it was all hand to mouth. So to really to make these things happen. And it was because we had this integrated service delivery. We weren't selling one thing. We weren't PR firm. We weren't lobbying firm. We were problem solving firm, or opportunity creating firm. And maybe a place you went when you couldn't afford to fail. That was something we aspired to do and be. So it was a very high standard, and people were attracted to that. And then the second thing is, and I go way back with this notion of having something that was very local, that we had excellent people on the ground who really knew their markets. But even in the most nationalistic countries, they were globalists, and they understood the importance of linking up to the world. And APCO was that platform. So in 1995, we went to London and Brussels, and then from there we expanded. From the Brussels office, somebody was Italian, went and started in Italy. Somebody was French, went and started in France. We added Germany. We added things as we went. And then I was on a soapbox saying that the world is going to move east, that Asia is just going to be that much more important. This is the 1990s. And in 1997, we opened in Hong Kong, and then shortly after in Beijing and Shanghai. And then we spread across Southeast Asia as well. So, it was, maybe if this ever got studied by people who knew something about business, they'd say I did it all wrong. We went before we had clients. We took a lot of risks that maybe we shouldn't have taken, but we found great people who who thrived in those situations. And there were days I didn't know whether we were going to, make it or not. But, I thought one thing about leadership is that you have to have a certain level of confidence that you bring to other people if you want them to follow you. So I always joke that I'd make these decisions and I'd be very emphatic about it, and then I'd go in the bathroom and throw up because, I didn't know if they're the right thing to do. It just was my sense that it was the right thing to do. Luckily, I was right more than I was wrong, or we wouldn't be here today. But that's really what happened. So it wasn't like there was this path or this definitive path. It's that, we took things as they came. We had a very engaged group of leaders. We fought for what we have and what we had. And then that kind of led up to, we did this kind of quietly. We weren't really on anyone's radar for a longest time. And part of that was that Gray had a PR company called GCI. So we weren't that, and we didn't want to be meshed with that. So we just went ahead on our own merry way. And just by word of mouth, we just kept growing. And then, we had a good friend and the CEO of Gray, and Ed Meyer, who I think was very intrigued by what we did. But when it came close to his retirement time, I felt like that if we weren't spun off from Gray, we would be consumed by whatever followed. And I didn't know how accurate that was, but I convinced Ed that that he should spin us off. This is not 2004. So we're Gray from 1991 to 2004. And we kind of just kept building this under the radar and investing our profits in the next step. And then in 2004, we, through a process, we were able to do a management buyout. And within a couple months after that, Gray was sold to WPP, which we didn't know at the time that that was going on until we announced the management buyout. And then I heard from WPP that they didn't want us to go, but we had already pretty much agreed on everything. And so we snuck out. We left town at midnight, Our second office was Moscow, 1988. So it was still the Soviet Union. And so it's a very different point in time, and it was just opening up. It's hard to remember that now, but there was a window. I call them the window generation, even, of people who had been very excited about entrepreneurial activities and were even leaning a little west, and they just were like sponges and wanted to learn anything, everything. And we were the first Western consulting firm that did this kind of work. And so we were able to meet some of the people who ultimately became the ultra rich while they were still selling computers out of their cars, and while they were taxi drivers or doing other things. And so, we had a lot of mutual learning and credibility, and it was a very exciting time. And so we went because Arnold and Porter, who we were affiliated with at the time, had been given a contract to rewrite the joint venture laws under Gorbachev, so it could be more of an open economy. And so we were kind of in harm's way, and people would come by and wonder about entering the market. And so we figured there was a business opportunity that nobody was so experienced with, and we, as a relatively new firm, could be helpful because we had relationships. And so that's how it started. And over time, we ended up not only helping a lot of the better companies become global, but also help to expose the West to Russia and Russia to the West. And it was a very interesting experience. But over time, the people that we work with also, when Putin came to power, were this very same people who kind of ran afoul of Putin. They were the people who opened up free media, for instance, and launched a satellite over Russia to be like CNN, and or Yukos, the oil company, is the fourth largest in the world, and their leader was the wealthiest man in Russia at the time, but also was trying to help with the corruption. Felt the country would never go anywhere if they didn't address corruption, and that ran afoul of Mr. Putin and his circle of people. So for us, working in Russia was never about working for the administration, if you want to call it that. It was always helping the companies that needed help come out of the market, but also helping people navigate what was a very opaque market. So, so I guess you'd say over the years, we, instead of trying to build behind the growth of that office, we migrated to a situation where it was more of an information office with less commercial activity. And then when the war broke out, we made the decision that we would not continue any commercial operations there, but that we would continue the office, because the office enabled us to get information and help with the execution of things for existing clients that didn't want to rely on what they read in the newspaper. What are the latest rules and regulations, so that when our government does something, we understand what's going, what the other side of that is, because our clients not only have to navigate the sanctions from the West, they also have to make sure that their people on the ground, even as they close down or whatever they choose to do, aren't in peril because they're violating some Russian piece of this. And it's almost impossible to coexist between the US sanctions and the Russian actions. And so people don't know whether their assets are going to be confiscated, or whether they're just going to be put on ice for a while, or whether people are going to come in and just run it. They just don't know, because some of this is essential to the economy there and global supply chains. I mean, I think we're going to see a real impact on fertilizer, on food, on related things. I think if you could say we specialized in something, I think because of our early experience in Russia. Remember, this is now in the 80s, APCO is only 4 years old. I think we learned a lot about markets that aren't as transparent, and how companies, what kind of help they need in markets like that. And so when we went to China, which was less than a decade later, in the 90s, we actually were very successful there from the get-go, because we knew how to operate in these markets in transition. And so, yes, we have gone to a lot of places that maybe other people have found difficult. But we think, given the kind of services we provide and what our clients are looking for, it's essential to be able to help them navigate the world. When we went to some of these markets, this was not a profession. And so a lot of what we did early on was to teach people how we did business, and to include them over time. And there was a point in China where, especially on the government relations side, I think we invented the profession. And almost every major company seemed to have an APCO person in it now, from somewhere, because we've trained a lot of people over the years. I think that in the Middle East, you have to remember, these are societies that have not traditionally done a lot of two-way communication with constituencies. And so all the government agencies there, they've leapfrogged what our government does in terms of accountability and responsibility, and communication's an important part of that. And so a lot of what they've been interested in is, what are some of the best practices that other governments have done, and how do they consistently communicate? How do they take feedback, evaluate it, and put it back out there? So I think that that's just an interesting, it's interesting to see these countries really pay attention to what they're doing in terms of communication.
So
There were always early adopters that seemed to go beyond what was expected in the marketplace. But I think the whole idea of what some people call it stakeholder capitalism, or, something along those lines, I think is more important than it ever has been. And I think part of this is the realization that business um, has certain attributes that can help fix and solve problems that government can't do, and government can't do everything. And so I think this idea of public-private partnerships and coming together and sharing best practice and all of that is important. And then companies kind of standing up to say, well, I really have these resources and I care about water, and water is important to the future of my company, so I'm going to do this. Or pick any of the elements that will be scarce in our future, and or that contribute to climate issues. And you'll see that there's always an option or a thought about how to replace things that cause harm with other things. And so I think a lot of companies now stand back and say, okay, why am I in business? It's not just what do I do, and how do I sell my product? It's like, why do we exist? Well, I think companies have decided that by virtue of how they spend their money, that the old advertising model was fairly wasteful, depending upon what your product is, because you had to broadcast to get to a narrow audience. And it was the audience you got to was some subset of this larger audience that didn't really care about your products. And so you were spending money in places you probably didn't have to. And today, through social media, through, addressable television, through all these other kinds of channels, you can really target. You can create tremendous efficiencies by speaking only to those people who care about your product or your issue. And so I think that that the media is changing, and I think it'll continue to change. The industry has expanded in what it is. So I think that, as women are looking for professions, it's suited a lot of ways to the skills that women have, the intuition, the intuitive skills, the, what people would say, some of the softer skills. I mean, besides the writing part of it. And I just think it was attractive to women as an alternative of professions. But I don't know. I'm trying to think of our top ranks, and it's about equal. We don't walk into an APCO room and it's all women, but it certainly isn't all men either. So I think having a mix is really important. I think some of the more product-oriented firms have a lot more women. Maybe women identify with the products more because they're mostly consumers, and a lot of those purchasing decisions are women. I think that's part of it. I think it's maybe easier to get in the door. For us, it's a mixture because we also have a lot of people who came from public policy. And while there are a lot of women in public policy, when I started this, there weren't a lot of women compared to now. So we have men who've really been outstanding, but we've had a good mixture between men and women. I think from the public relations, but I think that we have to be careful that we attract men into public relations also. And I know with all the emphasis on college and college age kids and recruiting from schools and all of that, that the pool just tends to be larger in women than in men. I also think it depends what part of the country you're in. I think that writing is an issue for universities in general. I don't think this just started with social media. Somewhere along the line, appropriate use of the English language went a little bit by the wayside. And it's really the unusual person who's the talented writer, not everybody vying for being the best of that. And I think that's unfortunate. I mean, we still give writing tests at APCO. We think writing is an important part of communicating and what people do. So we think that's important. I'm not sure I would pass.